We've had the joy of having Dr. Gottman speak many times, and I don't know a couple who is not in need of a little chiropractic adjustment. He was voted one of the top 10 most influential therapists of the past quarter century by the Psychotherapy Networker publication. Dr. Gottman's breakthrough research on marriage and relationships has earned him numerous major national awards. He's the author of 200 academic articles and co-author of 41 books. He's the co-founder of the Gottman Institute, where he currently teaches popular workshops for couples and parents, trains therapists from all over the world. In addition, Dr. Gottman provides intensive marathon couples therapy and offers weekend retreats for small groups and couples on Orcas Island. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Gottman to another sellout event, and he's going to present his newest research on how to make relationships work and build lasting love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to tell you the story of the past 41 years of my research on couples. And it really began when I was an assistant professor at Indiana University and having coffee with the guy who became best man at my wedding and a best friend. We've collaborated all these years. And his name is Bob Levinson, and he's a professor of psychology at University of California, Berkeley. And so Bob and I were assistant professors just sort of starting our career out. And as we were having coffee once a week, we realized that our relationships with women were not going very well. We just kind of go from one disaster to another. And so, we were basically two clueless guys about relationships. And we decided that since we really didn't know very much about relationships, we would do research on relationships. And we had no hypotheses because we were pretty clueless. So we kind of built this lab, and this was in the mid-1970s, before personal computers. So we had a computer in our lab that was called a PDP-11. It was about the size of 3 refrigerators. You can imagine that. It does less than your cell phone does now. But what it did was to synchronize the video time code with physiological measures that we collected, because we were really interested in emotion and the role that emotion played in relationships. And Bob and I were both learning and studying with Paul Ekman, who was one of the people who really studied facial anatomy and facial expressions. And he's sort of Mr. Facial Expression. And we had that in common. So this PDP-11 synchronized people's heart rates, how fast their blood was flowing, skin conductance, which is how much you sweat from these eccrine glands that we have on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. And they're very sensitive to psychological stimuli. And we also put a little platform under people's chairs that we call the jiggleometer that measured how much they moved around. So basically, all we did was to have people come into this lab, couples come into this lab at the end of a day after they've been apart for 8 hours. And they talked about how their day went. And then we interviewed them about their major conflicts, what they fought about. And we asked them to take the worst conflict and try to resolve it in the next 15 minutes while we videotaped them. They were pretty heartless people, so, and then we had them talk about something they enjoyed talking about. And then we showed them their videotape, and we asked them to turn this dial from very negative to very positive, along the way, just telling us how they were feeling, moment by moment. And then we sent them home. And we recontacted them 3 years later. Now, just to give you an idea of the state of couples therapy at the time when Bob and I were beginning this research, there was a bestseller that came out in the late 60s, written by Dr. George Bach. And Dr. Bach claimed in this book that the problem with marriages when they became unhappy was that people weren't expressing their anger and resentment directly. And so his therapy consisted of a couple facing one another, and they would take turns saying what they resented about their partner. And he gave them these foam rubber bats that they would whack each other with, So, I might, I might be sitting with my wife, Julie, and, she'd stand up in this therapy and she'd say, "You're not helping enough in the housework." And she'd whack me with her bat and sit down. And then I would say, "Well, we're not having enough sex." And I'd whack her with my bat. And we would do this for an hour and then write a check to Dr. Bach. This was the state of couples therapy at the time. We began in the 70s. Now, the other thing about where psychology was in the 1970s was that it was kind of at an impasse. There was a psychologist, a famous psychologist named Walter Mischel, who wrote a book called Personality and Assessment. Now, you may know Walter Mischel because he's the guy who invented a test for children called the marshmallow test. He took these 4-year-old kids and he put a marshmallow in front of them. He videotaped them. And he said, "You can eat this marshmallow now, or if you wait a little while, I'll give you 2 marshmallows." And you can see this on YouTube if you go ahead and type in the marshmallow test. And you can see little kids going, "I really want to eat that marshmallow. It looks really good. But if I wait, I'll get 2 big marshmallows. But I want to eat it now." And so, that's how it goes. And some kids just ate the marshmallow, and some kids, waited. And so then Dr. Mischel got in touch with these kids 20 years later. It takes a lot of persistence. And he discovered that the kids who waited for 2 marshmallows had higher SAT scores, they did better in college, and their lives were just better in general. So that he became famous for that marshmallow test. So he wrote this book, Personality and Assessment, and basically said, psychology's ability to predict human behavior really sucks. The best measures of personality can account for about 9% uncertainty, and 91% is completely unknown. So you really can't predict human behavior very well at all. And of course, we were getting evaluated for tenure, and the people evaluating us said, "You guys are crazy studying 2 people. If you can't predict one person's behavior, you're just going to square your error. You'll never predict anything. You'll never find anything." So we were as surprised as anybody else when 3 years later we recontacted these first group of couples, and we could predict 90% of the uncertainty in how their relationship happiness would change. And the findings were very simple. Basically, the people whose hearts were beating faster, whose blood was flowing faster, who jiggled around more, who sweat more from their endocrine glands, their relationship went down in happiness over the 3-year period. And the people who were calm, their relationship improved over that 3-year period. Plus, the rating dial, this little rating dial we had, the people who rated their interaction more positively, their relationships got better over time. And the ones who rated it more negatively, their relationships got worse over time. And also, since we videotaped them, I could really develop ways of, looking at how they talk to each other, both verbally and non-verbally, and examine that. So when we put it all together, we were able to account for this change in people's relationships with very high accuracy. And of course, the people evaluating us for tenure said, "You'll never replicate this. This is just an accident. And you'll never get a grant to do this research because, this is really stupid to study marriages scientifically." And so we got a grant, and they said, "Well, you'll never replicate," and we replicated. So Bob and I did this study over and over again for 23 years. We kept following couples and doing the same study over and over again. In fact, we just completed a study that it took us 20 years to do. We started 20 years ago with one group of couples in the Bay Area who were in their 40s and another group in their 60s, and we followed those 2 groups for 20 years. And mostly it was Bob who got the money to do that. And so we basically did, for 23 years, we were really studying relationships. I was really interested in studying them across the life course. So when I got to University of Washington, I built an apartment lab, which was designed to be kind of like a bed and breakfast getaway. Rather than giving people tasks to do, I wanted to see what are they like when they're more natural, just hanging out. And, it's kind of like a romantic setting. And it was on the medical school campus, so you could see boats going by the Montlake Cut and, geese and ducks out there and a park they could walk out in. And they basically spent 24 hours in this apartment. And they could do anything they wanted. They could read and watch TV and listen to music and work if they wanted to work, or, they had dinner there and cleaned up, and they just spent 24 hours there. And it was essentially a very relaxed kind of setting, except that we had 3 cameras bolted to the wall that followed their movements. And they wore Holter monitors that measured 2 channels of electrocardiogram. And when they urinated, we took a urine sample to measure endocrines. And we took blood from them to look at the endocrine and immune system. And people in the other room were coding their facial expressions. But aside from that, it was a very relaxed, romantic setting. And so we followed 130 newlyweds in Seattle a couple of months after the wedding and followed them. I've always been interested in child development and infancy. And so we followed them as, many of them got pregnant and had babies. And then we studied the babies and the parent-infant interaction and so on. So we kept doing this work over and over again. Bob and I also studied, for 12 years, we studied a group of gay and lesbian couples as well in committed relationships. And what we found was that our patterns really did replicate over time. So I want to give you an idea of what we discovered. Now, in all that time, Bob once came to the University of Washington to give a talk, and there was one of my colleagues at the University of Washington, Neil Jacobson, who really was doing pioneering research on couples therapy. And he raised his hand and he said, well, how can you use your basic findings to help people? And Bob said, well, John and I have been working together now for about 20 years, and I'm proud to say we've never helped anybody. So we were actually afraid to help people because we found that when couples got therapy of any kind in our samples, they were more likely to get a divorce or breakup than if they got no therapy. So we went, let's just now. But then 17 years ago, my wife and I were talking about this, and she's a clinical psychologist, and she really is a very sensitive person, and she likes to help people. And so she said, well, why don't we collaborate and use your research to find a way to help people. And I said, well, I don't really want to help anybody. I'm making a good living just watching people deteriorate. So we compromised and decided to help people. First, I want to give you some idea of what was that Bob and I accomplished in 23 years of doing the same study over and over again, over time in different settings. And basically what we did was we divided our couples into the masters of relationships and the disasters of relationships, 2 different kinds of groups. And by disasters, we mean people who stay together and are really unhappy, or people who break up. And the masters, we have very low standards for what a master is. We mean people who stay together and more or less like each other over time. So our basic question was, are there any patterns that are similar for the masters? Because we're looking at in all these different cities in which we've worked and groups of couples, and we use representative samples. So we have African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Anglo American, all kinds of different ethnicities in our samples. Is there any commonality? And we're looking across the whole lifespan. Are the masters similar in some way? And are the disasters similar in some way? So we actually found that really the disasters were very different in the way they talked about a conflict discussion. They were also different in all the other ways too. What we first did was we really computed the number of seconds in 15 minutes that people were positive, like they were interested in one another, they asked questions, they were curious, they were excited about their partner's ideas, they were affectionate, there was humor, they were empathetic and understanding. And then we divided that by the number of seconds that they were hostile, disappointed, they had hurt feelings, they were sad, they were anxious, they were tense, they were depressed, and so on. And that ratio of positive to negative was the first thing we computed. And we found that in the masters, that ratio during conflict was 5-to-1, 5 times as many positive as negative seconds. So that kind of surprised us. The disasters, that ratio of positive to negative was 0.8. So there's a little bit more negativity than positivity. Not a lot, just a little bit more. And so in the apartment lab, though, where people weren't engaging in conflict, they were just hanging out together for 24 hours, that ratio of positive to negative was 20-to-1 for the masters, okay? And still 0.8 for the disasters. So a relationship has to be a very rich climate of people being nice to each other, just the opposite of what Dr. Bach found. The masters are kind, they're gentle, they're understanding, they minimize defensiveness in their partner, and they do this in very interesting ways. So, Dr. Bach was completely wrong. The masters are gentle. They're not airing resentments at all. Here we were looking at, are all negatives equally corrosive in a relationship? And we actually were able to identify 4 things that were the most corrosive for the disasters. And I called them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So, that comes from the book of Revelations by John, where, the end of the world, these 4 horsemen ride together and they're pestilence, famine, war, all that kind of stuff. But in a couple's conversation, the 4 things are, first of all, criticism. And criticism is the first horseman of the apocalypse. And what criticism is really pointing your finger at your partner and really saying, I've been watching you and observing your behavior. As far as I can tell, I'm pretty much perfect. But you are defective. This relationship is not going to go anywhere until you get therapy and change your personality. And then they point out all the ways in which their partner is defective. And the critical person, really doesn't mean to be nasty. They're trying to be constructively critical. And they're hoping that their partner will respond to them by saying, John, thank you so much for pointing out all the ways in which I am failing as a human being. Can we have lunch next week and you can tell me more? That's what the critic is kind of hoping for. Some appreciation and recognition, and they'd like to hear something like, you're such an intelligent observer, too, so insightful. But instead, what they get is the second horseman of the apocalypse, which is defensiveness. And defensiveness is either, in our lab, was either counterattack, right, coming back and saying, well, let me point my finger at you. You're not so perfect, and I've been observing you, and here's what's wrong with you. Okay, that's one way of being defensive. And the other way is to act like an innocent victim. It's not my fault. I really try hard. What about all the good things I do in this relationship? They don't get noticed. I can't do anything right. No matter what I try, it's always wrong with you. And some people are really good enough so that they can do the innocent victim and the counterattack at the same time. They're really good at this defensiveness. Now, what are the masters doing? Well, first of all, in terms of the first horseman, criticism, rather than pointing their finger at their partner, they're pointing their finger at themselves. And they're kind of minimizing this and saying, this is not a big deal, and, this relationship is okay, but, I do feel a little bit frustrated when I try to talk to you about my day and you're not really listening, and, you're on your cell phone and you're texting 3 people at the same time, and that kind of hurts my feelings, and I really need you to put away your cell phone during dinner. So they're really specific, and they're saying, here's what I need. This is my recipe for success with me. And even if their partner's critical, what the masters do, rather than getting defensive, is they take responsibility, even for a small part of the problem. They say stuff like, that's interesting. You might be right. I don't think I've been listening to you very well. And I've been kind of grumpy lately. So tell me more about what's going on for you. I want to hear what you're thinking, what you're feeling about this. So that they take responsibility. And even if you take responsibility for a small part of the problem, it's enough to diffuse things. Now, the third horseman is what we call contempt. And contempt is anything you say from a superior place, right? If you think you're better than your partner, like you're more punctual or you're better informed on a topic or you're think you're more intelligent or you're a better parent or you're neater than your partner or a better dresser, any kind of superiority, you sort of talk down to your partner. And contempt, most contempt was, insults or name-calling or, something like that, or mockery of your partner, repeating your partner's words in a mocking way. And contempt was our best predictor of divorce in heterosexual couples. And the masters really did almost none of it. And the disasters did a fair amount of contempt. And some of them even did contempt when they were talking about how the day went. Like I remember this one husband who said to his wife, "Why don't you go first talking about your day? Won't take you very long." Okay? Right away, starting with contempt. So not only was contempt our best predictor of relationship breakup and divorce, but it was a predictor of how many infectious illnesses the recipient of contempt would have in the next 4 years. And the Glazers at Ohio State University were able to actually study white blood cells and lymphocytes and find that contempt was related to T cells not proliferating as well, and natural killer cells, which really police against tumor development, not being as cytotoxic, not being as effective at policing tumors. So really there's a wide spectrum degradation of the immune system with contempt. So contempt you can think of as sulfuric acid for love and sulfuric acid for health in relationships. And it became one of my hobbies to collect ways in which people can be contemptuous. I became really interested in this, and I discovered that, for example, in Kentucky, when we gave a workshop, that there's a particular way of being contemptuous in the American South. And so, for example, you can say almost anything nasty about somebody if you say the right words after it. So like you could say, "Look at that woman. Doesn't she realize she looks like a slut in that dress? Bless her heart." So if you say "bless her heart," you can say the most vile things in the world in the American South. And one of my favorite ways of being contemptuous is correcting somebody's grammar when they're angry with you. So if my wife says, "Now, I could care less about that, John," I say, "Just a minute, Julie. The proper way to say that is, I couldn't care less, not I could care less. Now, what was your point?" I like that one a lot. That's sort of the professorial way of being contemptuous. Now, what are the masters doing instead of contempt? Well, that turns out to be really pretty interesting, because we really learned about that in the apartment lab. Because what they're doing is they really are, in very small moments, creating a culture of appreciation and respect and affection in the relationship. And they're really building what we call the fondness and admiration system, which is about respect and affection. And they're building that in very small ways. They're just kind of saying things like, "Thanks for making the bed. I enjoyed the conversation at dinner. That was fun." Or, "I watched you playing with the baby, and you're an amazing, amazing father. I just love the way you play with our son." And, they're saying this stuff a lot. And they're sort of building an emotional bank account in the relationship. And I think the real difference between the masters and the disasters there in the area of contempt is that the masters have a habit of mind in which they're scanning their social environment for things they can appreciate and communicating that appreciation, really clearly in the moment. Whereas the disasters are really scanning their social environment for other people's mistakes and trying to correct them and make them, and if they can correct people's mistakes, then maybe they won't be so unhappy. That's kind of what they're thinking. And we found in our lab that this habit of mind transfers to their children as well. So that the disasters, when they're teaching their 4-year-old kid something new, they really give the kid a lot of information, and then they hang back and wait for their child to make a mistake, and then they come in and criticize their child. Whereas the masters wait for their child to do something right, and then they come in and use very specific praise. So in one case, the criticism, when people are trying to learn something, they make more mistakes and their performance goes down. Whereas if you wait for people to do something right and give them a little more information and praise them, their performance goes up. So this criticism is really a very interesting sort of habit of mind. And you might think, well, the masters, their habit of mind, that's sort of like looking at the world with rose-colored glasses. That's got to be an inaccurate way of looking at the world. But it turns out that actually it's more accurate. And it's really the disasters who distort even neutral things as negative. It's like they have a chip on their shoulder, and they really see things as negative even when they're not. Okay? They're ready to respond to negativity. They scan their partner's face when he or she walks into a room, and they see a storm building, even if it's not there. And the other thing about the negative habit of mind, and this was a study done in 1980 by Robinson and Price. They put observers in people's homes just measuring positive things between husband and wife. And they trained the husband and wife to do the same thing. And they found if they were happily married, the outside observer and the partners were completely in line. But if they were unhappily married, the partners missed 50% of their partner's positivity. You just didn't see it, right? Which is a cool thing if you're a therapist, because you can change people very quickly, because all you have to do is change perception. You have to know how to change perception, but then they'll see 50% of the behavior that's already there. You don't have to change behavior, it's already there. All that positive stuff is there, people are not seeing it. Okay, so the fourth horseman of the apocalypse was very interesting, and we call this stonewalling. And stonewalling was really an index of emotional withdrawal from the relationship. Now, usually when people are listening, it turns out around the planet, they really give speakers cues that they're tracking. Not necessarily that they agree, but they keep their bodies kind of open, they maintain eye contact, they nod their heads, they move their facial muscles, and they utter these brief vocalizations. So they go, oh yeah, could be, oh, yeah, oh, yeah. Oh, no kidding. Oh, yeah. So that's a listener. The stonewaller doesn't do that. They look away and down. No facial movement. No vocalization. No head nodding. And so this looks to the speaker like disapproval. And so the speakers kind of think, I'm not getting through. And maybe the 10-pound cannonball is not doing anything. Let's try the 25-pound cannonball. So negativity escalates when people are stonewalling. So we're really curious about this stonewalling thing. First of all, 85% of our stonewallers in heterosexual relationships were guys. This appears to be something men do. Women do it some, but not a lot. And so we were very curious whether when we study lesbians, do lesbians stonewall? And they absolutely do. So it wasn't biology quite, or gender. But then we discovered that a heart rate of above 100 beats a minute was a good predictor of people stonewalling in the next 10 seconds. So we thought, this is something about calming down. So we started interviewing guys in heterosexual relationships about what they were thinking and feeling when they were stonewalling. And this is kind of what's going through the stonewaller's mind. Okay. How long can she go on like this? The woman's going to give herself a heart attack. I could say something now. Don't say anything. You always make it worse. Just, try to leave as soon as you can. Tell her you got somewhere to go. You got some important thing to go to. Tell her anything. That happened 6 years ago. I can say something now. Don't say anything. 10 minutes to the game. She can't touch me then. So this is what's going on in the mind of the stonewaller. Really a self-soothing, don't make it worse kind of thing. Now, the masters also, have this physiological arousal, but they cope with it differently. They really breathe, they self-soothe, they find ways of calming down. Like one guy who said, in the middle of this argument that he was having with his wife, and his heart rate got really high, and then he said, "Say, those are nice shoes." And she said, "Well, they weren't very expensive shoes." And he said, well, they're pretty shoes. So are you going to wear those to the dinner party this week? Yeah, I thought I would. Well, do you have something to go with it? I think I might, but I might have to get something new. Well, you should really, And his heart rate went down, and her heart rate went down. And then they got back to the issue. They self-soothed, and then they got back to the issue. Okay, so those are the things that predict divorce. Now, so we found a lot of predictors, but they weren't really very useful in terms of Julie's goal of helping people. For example, we found that there was more humor and affection in the couples the newlyweds, a couple of months after the wedding, who stayed married compared to the 17 couples who divorced within 6 years of the wedding. Lot more affection, a lot more humor. Okay, so, that's great. That's a really useful finding. So how do you use that to help people? Can you say, okay, I'm your therapist, and the next time you talk about his mother, and I know this is very upsetting for you, would you try smiling and laughing more? People have actually tried that, believe it or not, and it doesn't work, I mean, a couple will say something like, "You don't know his mother, she's not funny." It's hard to laugh about this. So the prediction only goes so far, really, and you can't really figure out how to help people. You have to have some kind of understanding of how the whole process works. And this is the understanding that Julie and I came up with as a way to really be able to help people. And we call this the sound relationship house theory. Now we put it together as a theory not because we wanted to be a new school of therapy that would have adherents, We put it together as a testable theory that could be disconfirmed, and there could be scientific investigations that said, well, that's wrong, and this, and we could modify it over time, right? So let me tell you what this theory is about. It's a house with 7 levels, and then it's got 2 walls, and one of the walls says trust, and the other wall says commitment. Okay, so let me explain this to you. The first 3 levels of the sound relationship house are what we mean by friendship. Okay, so, if you're doing research and you're a scientist, you can't stay vague. Because you got to measure what you're talking about. You got to really be able to count it and measure it and show that it's reliable and valid as a measure. And so, when we talk about friendship, we automatically get recipes because we can measure stuff for making things better. Okay. And let me tell you what we mean by friendship. So the bottom level of the sound relationship house is called build love maps. And what we mean by that is that some people really do build kind of a roadmap of their partner's inner world. And they do that by really asking open-ended questions. And an open-ended question is a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer. It really opens the heart. So maybe a question like that might be, so, what adventures would you like to have in the next 5 years? Do you like this place we live in? How would you change it, to make yourself happier in it? What's missing? What needs to change? Or, so what would you like our life to be like 3 years from now? Are there some ways in which you've changed in the last 2 years? How would you say you've changed as a person? So these are open-ended questions, right? And and the masters are asking these questions. And so 2 things are important about open-ended questions. One is asking them, and the second one is remembering the answers, okay? And I mean, that may sound kind of silly, but, we've had couples in our office where, one person says, I don't know what you find erotic. And the partner says, I've told you many times. And I say, okay, this time take notes. Because that's important information. It's going to be on the test, all right? You want to know what your partner finds erotic. So, that's what love maps are about. We have an equivalent love map for building a love map of your partner's erotic life. 100 questions you can ask a woman and 100 questions you can ask a man about, very specific questions about their erotic world. Okay, that's love maps. Now, the interesting thing is the people who don't build love maps in our workshops, they go, well, okay, so is that going to be important to you? And the partner usually says, yeah, it is, because it means you're interested in me, you want to know me, you're interested in how my mind works, what my world is like. Okay, and then we, teach them how to do that in exercises that are a lot of fun. Like we have card decks that have questions, these open-ended questions, and then they ask the questions, and they try to answer the questions, and they build a love map. And then when people learn how to do that, they go, okay, I can do that. So that's love maps. Okay, now the next level is fondness and admiration. And this is the habit of mind of noticing what's going right, catching your partner doing things right, and really commenting on it. And that is a very different approach. And, and it's one that really our culture doesn't actually support that way of looking at things, right? I mean, you think if somebody goes around, all day appreciating what they experience, they've got to be a total idiot, right? I mean, the intelligent, discerning, sophisticated person is critical, right? We even call logical thinking in our schools for our children critical thinking. We don't call it logical thinking, we call it critical thinking. So you've got to be critical to be smart and observant and intelligent, right? So this idea of building fondness and admiration by suspending criticism and appreciating what you see and being affectionate about it and being respectful, that's a whole different way of thinking. And the masters are doing that. And the turning toward, that's the next level of the sound relationship house. So we call that turning toward bids rather than turning away. And the way that worked, it really got discovered in the apartment lab. And it's a very simple, sort of bullet point, but it took us 10 years to discover this. And what we noticed was that people were kind of constantly trying to get their partner's attention or interest or have a conversation or tell a joke or, be affectionate. And, they might, look out the window in the apartment lab and say, boy, sure is nice out there. That's a really pretty boat. Look at that boat. So then the camera would turn. In this case, the wife said that. And the camera turns to the husband. This guy's eating a bowl of cereal. And he's watching TV. And he hears, sure is pretty out there. That's a beautiful boat. No response. And we call that turning away. Okay? And it's not always mean-spirited. Sometimes people are just absorbed in what they're doing. And sometimes people turn toward. And what we mean by that is this guy might go, huh. That's as good as it gets a lot of times, But that's pretty good as a response, right? Now, I was really interested in what was the probability that you would rebid when your partner turned away. Now, in my marriage, my wife would have come over and looked me in the eye and said, I said there's a beautiful boat out there. So, that would have happened. Julie would have done that, And I would have said, huh? Oh, yeah, I guess, yeah. So the probability was almost zero that people would rebid when their partner turned away. It was actually zero in the couples who got divorced eventually, and it was 0.22, 22% of the time they would rebid in happy relationships. Okay, these are newlyweds. They're all supposed to be blissed out. Well, it turned out that, 17 couples divorced 6 years after the wedding. And those 17 had turned toward bids 33% of the time. And the ones who were still married had turned toward bids 86% of the time. It's a pretty big difference, okay? That's a hugely different habit of mind. And so this is this emotional bank account that the masters are building, in very small ways. Now, the other thing that we really noticed is that in all relationships, people have conflict and people have regrettable incidents. And one of the contributions that Bob and I actually made in this research was we looked at happy relationships and stable relationships. And most of the books have been written by clinicians who only see unhappy couples. And often, we clinicians don't come from very happy families. So we have to imagine what really good relationships are like, But we actually watch good relationships. And the major difference between the masters and disasters was that the masters, when they hurt their partner's feelings, they repaired it. And the repair was successful. So, for example, in our apartment lab, this newlywed couple, this is a couple of months after the wedding, and they have this little argument, and he says, well, I'll tell you, the problem with you is that you don't follow through with things in your life. You let them go. And I follow through. I don't let them go. I'm tenacious, and you're not. And they have this, she feels really criticized and put down and hurt, and eventually they stop speaking to each other, and she's sitting there like this, and he's going like that. And then he makes a repair. He says, okay, so now that we've destroyed each other's personalities, how about a piece of cheesecake? And she says, all right, maybe. And they're sitting there eating the cheesecake at the same table, and she's glaring at him and looking away, and, he's not looking at her at all. And they're eating the cheesecake. And he says, well, that really sucked. She says, yeah. He says, I'm sorry. She said, you better be. Okay, so they repair, right? Some of them, they actually, go on, and this couple went on, and he said, how about another piece of cheesecake? She said, okay. And then they sat down, and as they were eating the second piece of cheesecake, he said, maybe I could say what I was saying in a different way. And she said, that would be great. And they had this wonderful conversation about his point. Okay. So repair is really critical. And it's not that the masters don't screw up. In fact, let me offer you a mathematical proof that I have that regrettable incidents and hurt feelings are inevitable in all relationships. Repair is necessary in all relationships. And so let me see if I can convince you of this. Now, if you sort of estimate the percentage of time that you're with your partner, that you are emotionally available, you're ready to listen with an open heart, with empathy and understanding, non-defensiveness, would you agree that 50% of the time is a generous estimate of emotional availability? Does that make sense? That's a lot, right? Okay. So that's like the probability of flipping a coin, an unbiased coin, and getting a heads rather than a tails, okay? Now ask the question, what's the probability that both people will be emotionally available, ready to listen with an open heart, non-defensively, compassionately at the same time? Assuming independence of those events, which is probably wrong, assuming independence, the probability is like flipping two coins and getting two heads, 25% of the time, that both people will be in sync, harmonious, resonating with one another. The other 75% of the time is ripe ground for misunderstandings, miscommunications, and hurt feelings. And if you use the more conservative estimate, like 30% emotional availability, 91% would be ripe ground for miscommunications and hurt feelings. So it's just that we have two different minds in a relationship. Doesn't mean, that we don't love one another and that we don't care. In fact, we need to hurt each other's feelings. We need to have conflict because that's how we learn how to love one another better over time. And we need to learn that. We need to grow together. And it's really the failures of communication and trying to understand those failures that help us really learn about our partner and reach a new level of understanding and meaning in our relationship. So repair turns out to be very important. Okay, well, let me tell you about these first three levels. What was surprising, we really thought that, and the hypothesis was, if that was working, if friendship was working, people would be, and the next level is called the positive perspective. And this came from the work of a guy named Bob Weiss at the University of Oregon. Bob said that people are either in the positive perspective, which means, when their partner is irritable or emotionally distant, they don't take it personally. They say, oh, she must be kind of stressed out, or he must be preoccupied, or something's going on. But if they're in the negative perspective, they take things personally. And they have a chip on their shoulder. They're looking for negativity. And they're hypersensitive to negativity. And that's the negative perspective. And our theory says people are in a negative perspective for good reason. It's not that they're narcissistic or, borderline or have some kind of psychopathology. They're in the negative perspective because the friendship isn't working. Either love maps, turning toward, or fondness and admiration are not working in that relationship. And that's why they're in the negative perspective. And the theory says you have to be in the positive perspective for repair to work. That's the theory, okay? And we found evidence for that. That seems to be true. Okay. What we didn't expect was that the first three levels of the sound relationship house are the basis for romance and great sex in a relationship. Let me convince you of that. I have a very simple proof. I have this book called 1001 Ways to Be Romantic. I didn't write it, but it's got a lot of good suggestions. And the second volume, which is called 2002 Ways to Be Romantic, has suggestions for lesbian couples and gay male couples as well. Well, number 24, the suggestion, number 24 in the first volume is addressed to guys. And here's the suggestion. It says, what could be more romantic than getting your partner a golden locket with your picture in the locket, okay? Let's take that suggestion, right? And let's think about love maps. So what if I haven't asked Julie, my wife, a question in 10 years? I don't care what she thinks. I want her to know what I think. So strike one. I strike out on love maps. And then fondness and admiration. If you observed us at a dinner party, you would see, Julie started to tell the story, and I said, Julie, don't tell us that story. You don't know how to tell a story. Let me tell it. So strike two on fondness and admiration. I'm critical and contemptuous, even in public. And then turning toward, I don't notice her bids. And so I strike out on all three levels of friendship. And then I get her a golden locket with my picture in it, okay? And my question is this going to be a romantic event in our relationship? I don't think so, right? She's probably going to back the SUV over that locket a couple of times, right? But if these three levels are working, she knows that I'm really interested in how her mind works and what her emotional world is like. I update my love maps every now and then. I really respect and admire her. I find her sexy and attractive, and she knows it. And I turn toward her needs when she expresses them. I turn toward those bids for connection. Then, I can write even a bad poem for our anniversary. And when I read it, I'll choke up and her eyes will fill with tears. So the basis of great sex is really maintaining this friendship. And researchers back this up. Research by Bernie Zilbergeld, where he looked at two groups of couples with a great sex life, couples with a not so good sex life. And the basic difference was maintaining friendship and emotional connection. So in a long-term relationship, it's really about continuing intimacy. And we now have a great product that is called the Art and Science of Lovemaking, similar to our Art and Science of Love workshop. And we call it Got Sex. That's our website, G-O-T-T, sex, which we found out when we went to Austria means God sex. And they were going, God sex? God sex? He said, yeah, God sex, We intended that. What about conflict? So in conflict, Bob and I discovered some very interesting things. First of all, we found that, here we were bringing couples back every 3 years, finding out what their conflicts were. Every 6 years, 9 years, 12 years, 15 years, 18 years, 20 years, same couples back, asking them what are your major problems are. And we discovered that 69% of the time, couples are arguing about the same stuff in the same way. with 80% stability over time. Now, most of these people aren't getting therapy, right? So we realized then that when you pick somebody to have a relationship with, you have automatically inherited your set of unresolvable problems you'll have for the next 50 years. And if you didn't pick that person, you wouldn't have those problems. You'd have another set of problems. So really, it kind of suggests that relationships work to the extent that you pick somebody whose problems you can live with. Okay? These problems never get resolved. They're actually, based on personality differences between people. And a lot of times, here's a funny finding, is that the very things we found attractive during courtship become intensely annoying once we start living with person. So we had this one couple in our 20-year study, and this lady is very extroverted, and and she's funny. She's got a great sense of humor, and she's not very careful with money, and she's very generous. And she married this guy who's very introverted. He's quiet, thoughtful. He's very intelligent. He really thinks about things. He needs a lot of time by himself to be energized. And he gets very quiet when he's upset. And so, she found this very attractive. He's a solid kind of guy. He's really thoughtful. He's conservative. He's loyal. He's always there. He's really like a rock. And, he's attracted to her in courtship. She's vivacious, exciting. He realizes he wouldn't have a social world if it wasn't for her. He'd have no friends. So they get together, and then, she'd like him to be more extroverted. Why can't you talk to me when you get upset? Well, what do you want me to talk about? Your feelings. Talk about your feelings. He says, I don't do feelings. Well, tell me what you're thinking. He says, I can try. And he says to her, do you have to spend so much money? Do you have to always invite the whole church to come over every Sunday? It's really noisy here, So there's their perpetual problems, right? And they argue about that all the time, right? But this couple is a master couple. So while they're arguing about it, they have a sense of humor. And she says, what I would like from you, she says, he says, yeah, is to tell me your deepest inner feelings. And he goes, oh. And she's laughing, and he's laughing. And she says, no, when you get tense, I really wish you wouldn't clam up and just talk to me. And he says, well, when I'm tense, I don't want to talk. She says, I know. But what are you worried about? And he says, I'm worried about money. And that's what I'm telling you is, you can't spend money when you want to. And she says, I know. And she says, well, what are you worried about? And he says, I don't think I can pay the insurance this month. She says, you're kidding. You can't pay the insurance this month? Didn't you set aside? He said, yeah, but stuff came up and I can't afford to pay it. And she says, well, I've got some money saved for a rainy day. He says, what do you mean a rainy day? She says, mad money. He says, well, how much mad money? She says, it's enough to cover the insurance. He says, okay. You're going to give me that? I am. See, and that shows that you need to talk to me when you get upset, because I can help fix the problem. And he says, yeah, we're cooking, baby. Right? So, they've got these perpetual problems, but they're kind of laughing about them and they're adjusting to them. Now, after this conversation, he is not going to turn into an extrovert. She is not going to turn into an introvert. They're going to stay the same people, right? But they're laughing about those problems. But some people get gridlocked on these perpetual problems. And every time they talk about it, they don't compromise, they spin their wheels, and they feel personally rejected by their partner. And they feel like compromise is a deal breaker. It feels in these perpetual problems that in order to live with this person for the sake of peace, you've got to change your personality. You've got to give up something that you really value about yourself for the sake of peace. And people aren't willing to do that. So we realize that not all conflicts are the same. These conflicts around perpetual problems are very different than general conflicts. 31% of the time, these couples have solved their problems 3 years later, and they're very different in the way they talk about them. So we realize that the masters and disasters are very different, but the worst problems, the ones that are gridlocked, there's something else going on. And by analyzing what they're talking about, we realize there's always a hidden agenda. People may be talking about money, but actually what they really are disagreeing about and where the gridlock occurs is not about money, but about what money means to each person. The meaning of each person's position is what's critical. And so when Julie and I developed the Dreams Within Conflict approach to dealing with those conflicts, then 87% of the time in our 2-day workshop, people move from gridlock to dialogue on these perpetual problems. Not that they solve them, most of the time they don't go away, but they can talk about them, and they can talk about their dreams, and they can find a way to honor each person's dream. So that the worst conflicts in a relationship, when you understand this, become the greatest sources of intimacy in the relationship. And it builds to the next level of the Sound Relationship House, which we call making life dreams come true. And I want to tell you about that too, because one of the things that we know is that we're living through a very special era in human relationships, especially love relationships, where women are being empowered in most of the world psychologically, economically, and socially. And so there's massive change that's going on in women. One of the things that we've learned is anybody who wants to be close to a woman today, really have an emotionally close friendship and intimate relationship with her, needs to honor her dreams. And that means knowing what her life dreams are, first of all. And so I want to tell you about one of my favorite movies, which is called Don Juan DeMarco. Anybody see that movie? Okay. Well, it's a little bit old now. Johnny Depp plays a mental patient in that movie, and he believes he's the reincarnation of the great Spanish lover Don Juan. And Marlon Brando is his psychiatrist, and he's about to retire, and he's married to Faye Dunaway. And Johnny Depp is incredibly poetic about what he loves about women. I mean, it's really a beautiful film. Marlon Brando is very moved by Johnny Depp, and so he's talking to his wife, Faye Dunaway, in their garden in one scene. And he's trying to convince her that retirement's going to be great, and then he kind of catches himself and realizes that he should really be more like Johnny Depp. So he says, "I'd like to know what your dreams are." And she gets very quiet. And she looks up at him. She's wearing this straw hat, and she looks really beautiful. And she looks up at him, and she says, "I thought you'd never ask." It's a great moment in the movie. And that's what that level of the Sound Relationship House is all about. My wife, when she was 49 years old, she told me that one of her life dreams was to go to Mount Everest Base Camp with 10 other women. And I responded to her dream by saying, "Are you out of your mind?" So I finally got behind this dream. I finally talked to her about what the Himalayas meant to her and what mountains meant to her. And, it was hard for me because, I get altitude sick on a ladder. So I don't go up high. And, and I found out that this whole trek up to Mount Everest, there was no room service, So it let me out entirely. But I started really understanding what mountains meant to her. Well, nature, for me, growing up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York, was taking the A train to Central Park and spreading out a blanket and having a picnic and then playing ball and then going home to Brooklyn. That was nature. And I didn't understand what nature was to her. But I began to understand it. And she trained for 2 years to make this trip and went up and down the stairs in Seattle, which are like thousands of stairs with a 40-pound backpack. And she got really strong and I thought, she should take out the garbage, right? She needs to lift weights for her, And so I did not read the book Into Thin Air until she came back, because, I tend to be kind of afraid of things. I mean, I can list 12 ways you can get killed in a picnic, And so going to Nepal and trekking, with Sherpas toward Mount Everest was not natural for me. But I got to understand what it meant to her. And I did not whine the whole time she was gone. She was gone for a month. And I made her take a satellite phone, so she called me every 2 days to tell me she was alive. And then when she came back, I had saved up my 4 weeks of whining. And there was this photograph of her on the top of Mount Kalapatar at 18,600 feet. And I have never seen her happier. And I have that in my office. And I go, okay. So as much as I could, I was able to honor her dream and understand it. And then I read Into Thin Air, and I was terrified. Creating shared meaning is the next level of the Sound Relationship House. And that really is about the way people create a life together. Because when you have a relationship with somebody, it's not just a relationship. It's not just dating, right? It's really building a life together. And building a life together is about making things have meaning. And people do that. Psychologists have studied how people create rituals of connection, ways of connecting in both formal and informal events. Really making Christmas mean something, or Ramadan, or Passover. The holiday cycle, making graduations really mean something. Making birthdays, anniversaries mean something. And talking about it intentionally. So Bill Doherty at the University of Minnesota in sociology, who's also a family therapist, wrote this great book called The Intentional Family. Bill Doherty said, you have these formal events, but there are so many other informal events in which you could make intentional the rituals of connection. So what should it mean when one person gets sick? It's part of the wedding vows, right? In sickness and in health, right? But do we ever talk about how you want to be treated when you get sick and what that means to you? What health and illness are all about in your family? Or what should a weekend be? Or, for example, people take leave of each other every day and then there's a reunion. What should the reunion mean? So I know that when I come home, the person who greets me with the most enthusiasm is my Welsh Corgi, Kobe. And he comes over and he said, "He's home. God, he's home. I can't believe he's home. Wow, he's home. I'm going to stand up on him and lick him, and he's home. Oh, God, I know I'm going to get some food now." I said, Kobe is really enthusiastic. And, we found that a lot of times it's the family dog that's greeting people. So, you can make a ritual of connection out of the reunion and really stop. And we recommend that people really not just embrace one another, but have a kiss that lasts at least 6 seconds. That's a kiss worth coming home to, I mean, really, think about that. That's a really delicious kiss. If you're married to a good kisser, I happen to be. And so, you can really make an event out of that. Or dinner time. Let's take dinner time, for example. So Doherty says in his book, 2/3 of American families no longer eat dinner together regularly. And of the third who do, half of them have the television set on. So no conversation, right? We recently did an evaluation of a couple who was on the Anderson Cooper show that they brought on. And I put a camera in their living room. They didn't have a dining room. Everybody ate in the living room. And they had a kitchen, but everybody ate in the living room. And they had this gigantic TV that was on all the time. And people came in and out of the living room and chowed down, and there was never conversation. Okay, so that's pretty much what Doherty found in his book. Now, here's another thing that's interesting. Recently, there was an article in the New York Times that talked about family factors that related to kids being successful in school, getting high SAT scores. And those families that had dinner together between 5 and 7 times a week, the kids had significantly higher SAT scores. Less than 5, much lower. It was a break point below 5. So here's a ritual of connection. Now, obviously, it's not chowing down together. People, when they really eat together as a family regularly, they actually talk about their days. They connect with one another. And so there's a ritual of connection. Another way that people create shared meaning is to have similar goals, similar values. They are members of a community. They contribute to that community. They have similar life dreams and missions. Mission, legacy, these are very important things in creating shared meaning. All of us are philosophers. All of us really think about the purpose of life. And in a relationship, we really share that, and we want somebody who can support that. And we start thinking about the meaning of life, when we're about 4 years old. My daughter, when she was 4, she came to me, very consistent with this thing I'm telling you. And she said to me, "Papa, where was I before I was born?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, am I going to die?" And I said, "Well, everybody dies, honey, but I hope not for a very long time." She said, "Well, where am I going after I die?" And I said, I don't know. And she says, "Well, why was I born?" And I said, I don't know. But honey, if you ever have a question, you can come and ask me. So she came the next day and she said to me, "Papa, I figured out 2 things." I said, "What?" She said, "Well, I figured out that the place I'm going to when I die is the same place I was in before I was born." I said, "Whoa, that is really cool." She said, "And the second thing I figured out is that Mama knows everything and you know nothing." Okay. That's almost everything that I know about relationships. But now, let me tell you about the more recent stuff that we've discovered. So I kind of wondered, if these 7 things work in a relationship, can you take any 2 people and have them be happy and stable in a relationship? I don't think so, right? And in looking at our longitudinal data following couples for many, many years and analyzing that data, the conclusion I came to is that, yes, in the very beginning of a relationship, our bodies are very selective about who we fall in love with. And we have this really sort of wild obsession. Psychologists call it limerence. And it really takes the right person who smells right and tastes right and feels right when you hold that person. And then this cascade of hormones and neurotransmitters is released. DHEA, testosterone, dopamine, oxytocin, vasopressin, a whole bunch of them. There's about 13 of them. And that cascade really creates this haze of being in love. And it creates this absolute ecstasy and delight in this person, and obsession with this person, and really bad judgment. Okay? So oxytocin is one of the major hormones of bonding and affiliation. And, you can now online buy a bottle of oxytocin and spray it up your nose. And the company that recommends this really says you should do this before you go out on a date. And then you'll have a better date. And that's true. You will have a better date, but you will ignore all the negative qualities of this person, and only see the positive qualities. And in fact, there's a Swiss study that shows that if you give people a lot of money and they spray oxytocin up these guys' noses, men and women, and compared to a group that gets saline put up their nose, that the oxytocin group, when there's a Swiss banker, a very well-dressed person who comes over and says, "Give me your money and I will quadruple your money in 2 weeks, or I may decide to keep it all and not give you any." And if you've had oxytocin sprayed up your nose, you say, "Okay, sounds good to me." But if you've had saline sprayed up your nose, you say, "Are you crazy?" And I call this the Bernie Madoff effect, right? And the Bernie Madoff effect is operating when we fall in love. That's phase 1. Now, it's very selective. Not anybody can set off this cascade. And it has to be a very special kind of person. But then we get to the next stage of love. And the next stage of love a lot of times the very qualities that we didn't see, the red flags, now we see them. We see all the things that are wrong with this partner. And we have some buyer's remorse. We start living with this person and we're not so sure. So all of the arguments the newlyweds had in my lab were all about one question, which was, can I trust you? Will you be there for me? If I'm upset, will you be there for me and listen to me? Do I come before your friends? Do I come before your mother? Will you be sexually faithful to me? Are you going to work hard? Will you take care of our children and be a good mother or father? All of these questions were about trust. Will you be there for me was the question. And if the answer is yes, that's the second phase of love. Now, what was surprising, and most people who talk about trust really say that if they're not building trust, then that's the same as having betrayal in the relationship. But what we discovered was that loyalty is the third phase in a loving relationship that lasts a lifetime. And loyalty is a very special thing that goes beyond trust. And it's really about cherishing your partner. It's really about celebrating what you have and nurturing gratitude for what you have in this person. It means you minimize your partner's negative qualities and maximize your partner's positive qualities. And you really, in your mind, cherish what you have. And other people really don't go on, even if they establish trust with one another and are there for one another. They are doing the opposite. They are thinking, when things get bad, when there's an argument, when sex doesn't feel very good, when they're a little bit lonely, when their partner's emotional distance, they think, I can do better. And they nurture, instead of gratitude for what they have, resentment for what's missing. And they start a cascade toward disloyalty and betrayal. Now, building trust and building loyalty and that cherishing process are very, very describable. And if one thing happens, you really get a relationship that moves not only with trust, but moves toward commitment. Now, what is commitment? So let me tell you a story, and this is my final story in my talk, about a couple I was seeing. And I was their sixth couples therapist. Okay, they had seen 5 other therapists. And of course, I thought, well, I'm such a good therapist, I'll really do great with them. And I thought we were doing pretty well. And then at our sixth session, the husband came in and said, this is going to be our last session. So I said, gee, I'm really sorry to hear that, because I thought we were doing pretty good work. He said, no, it's just not working for us. It's just, it's not worth the money. And so I said, okay, well, we have a 24-hour cancellation policy, so you've already paid for this session. Would you please do me the favor of just staying for this session, helping me understand why it was that I failed with you? What was it about the therapy that just didn't work? And, help me understand that. Would you do that for me? And I said, sure, we'll stay. So we talked about an argument they had the previous week. And here's what happened. They'd been at a party, and he was having a really enjoyable conversation with a woman. He'd never met her before. And he was really enjoying himself. And then his wife tapped him on the shoulder. They had 2 young children. And she said, I'm really tired. Let's go. And so they left. And he was very reluctant to go. And in the ride home, he said to her, I was really enjoying that conversation with that woman. And I was getting pretty turned on, actually, sexually by her. And she's a lot more interesting than you are. And, we just don't talk like that anymore. And I haven't been enjoying sex with you at all. And his wife found this a very unpleasant comment. And she escalated, and started saying, well, I haven't been enjoying life with you either. and she told him all the things that she didn't enjoy about him. They had this big row. And I said, what were you thinking during that argument? And she said, I was thinking, I wish I had a more mature man. Who needs this crap? I don't need to listen to this crap. I can do better. So I said, okay, thank you. I now understand why my therapy hasn't worked with you, and I understand why the other 5 therapists failed with you as well. You can go now, I said. And they said, what do you mean we can go now? I said, well, I understand, now, and you helped me understand. So now that I understand, we're done with the session. You can quit the therapy now and leave, as soon as I get my check, And they said, well, wait a minute, can you tell us what it is that you think, why the therapy failed? I said, okay, I'll try. You guys are married and you have 2 children. You have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and you bought a house together, but you really never got married to each other. And they said, what do you mean? We're married. I said, yeah, but you're not committed to each other. You never got to that phase of commitment. And they said, what do you mean? We're committed. And I said, no, you're not. Let me try to explain to you what commitment is. You know the story Alice in Wonderland? Yeah. I said, well, Alice, when the white rabbit goes down the hole, Alice does not peer over the hole and say, I don't know if I want to go down there. I'll get my dress dirty. Maybe another rabbit will come tomorrow, even a better rabbit. She doesn't do that. She just leaps into the hole. And that's her journey. She's totally in that journey. And of course, Wonderland is wonderful in some ways, but it's also nuts and there's the Red Queen and scary and, but that's her journey. She's 100% on that journey. But you guys, you're not really on this journey together. You're always thinking, maybe I can do better. And as long as you're thinking, maybe I can do better, you're not in this relationship. You're not committed to this relationship, and you're not cherishing one another. You're looking at what's missing in the relationship and wishing that you could have that somewhere else. And they left. And a couple of months later, they were with their 7th therapist working on commitment. So that's what commitment is about, and that's what trust is about. Thank you very much for listening.
The idea is for myself or my wife, actually for both of us, our parents never modeled any kind of verbal intimacy, which I'm sure we're not the only ones. Now, what happens when the spouse shares an intimate vulnerability that's negative, For example, I'm really feeling super down right now. The other spouse may feel, myself or she, may feel as if we're responsible, or we may feel as if it's kind of like maybe a hidden end-around passive-aggressive attack. So when it's not, and we've gotten past that in our relationship, but
great.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, how do we not go down that super negative rat hole?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things I had to learn in my relationship, and by the way, let me just say that, one of the things that we do, that Julie and I do in our workshop is we process a regrettable incident that we've had in the second day of our workshop, a real one. And, and that we do that really to say that we're in the same soup as all other couples. We're in no way superior to other couples. We learn these principles through research, but we have to use them. So we have to sort of arrive at this knowledge really through science and then apply it. So your point is really very, very important. And that is, how do you listen really with empathy and not get your own stuff involved? right? Not get defensive. And that's really hard to do. It's really difficult. And I think part of the problem, I've decided, is that really in our culture in the last 20 years or so, the ability to listen has really been declining. And that ability to be a great conversationalist and really listen to your partner is a skill that's really worth developing to build intimacy. How do you have an intimate conversation? And and part of what's required, I think, is to not take responsibility, just like you said, not take responsibility for your partner's feelings. So when Julie's crying, I don't really know what the tears are about. And they're probably not about me. Well, they may be about me, but I really need to ask, what are the tears about? And I need to sort of step back from it and listen and understand. So for a lot of us men, I think, and many women too, but especially for us guys, just being there and understanding doesn't seem like enough. It seems like we have to really help solve the problem, or that we're responsible for making our partner happy. And we got to give that up. And instead, this is a metaphor that I think really helps me. When you go to a foreign country, like you go to a small town in Italy, you're filled with questions, right? You say, so who built that church? How long has it been there? And why does it have 800 steps? And you have all these questions about the place. And if you can be the same kind of tourist, but this time really the landscape is your partner's mind, and you're really being a tourist in your partner's mind, and you're saying, tell me about being down. What is that like for you? What is it like in your body? What does that feel like? And what are you thinking about? And what do you think this is about? Is this about old stuff? Is there a fear here? Is there a worst case scenario? Tell me what your thoughts are. Is this like the last time you were down, or is this different? Or, what do you think can bring you up? And what are you looking for? All those questions that we have when we're tourists, but this time we're a tourist really in the landscape of our partner's mind and feelings. And then just give up the responsibility. And then what comes out of that kind of listening is real understanding. And you may not be able to fix it, but understanding always has to precede advice and problem solving. And if you go for the understanding, at least you feel closer, and at least she's not going to feel as alone with her sadness and depression. And that's the best you can do in a relationship, right? You don't leave your partner alone.
So my question, you may have touched upon it a little bit earlier, but it has to do with the kind of like the introvert-extrovert story that you had. When I have certain fights with my husband, it comes from certain personality characteristics that he both appreciates but drives him nuts. So, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. So for me, I can take care of a lot of things. I'm on top of things, and I'm a multitasker. But then, on the other side, my husband will say, oh my gosh, you're being too bossy when I'm suggesting things. He doesn't have to do it, take it or leave it. But, and I'm sure I've gotten that I'm bossy from my family members too from time to time. But by being a multitasker, I get a lot of stuff done. But sometimes he feels like I'm not a good listener. I'm trying to take care of too many things. But we have two little ones, so that comes with the territory. I can do a lot of stuff, but I'm bossy on the other hand, and I'm not a good listener. So what are some tools or ways that you can address that? Because sometimes when we fight, he just says, well, I don't know if we're really going to resolve this. It's just kind of the way you are and the way I am.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So the first thing that you said was that he says you're too bossy at times, right? So that is criticism, right? It's a global statement. He's pointing his finger at you and not saying what he needs, what he feels and what he needs, right? So it's work he has to do at that point. It's not anything you have to do. So if I'm saying my wife is too bossy, I'm being lazy, and maybe, I want to say, honey, you're much more efficient at getting things done, and I need some recognition that I get things done, but I'm slower than you are. You're really lightning fast, and I'm not. And you're taking care of a lot of stuff, and you have to multitask because there's so much to do when you have 2 young children. And yet, my strength is really focusing and going slower than you. So I need some appreciation of my style, right? Then that doesn't make you feel put down, right? And then when he's asking you to be a better listener, again, he's got to say, I know, we're up to here with, things we have to do. Our life has become this infinite to-do list. And I miss you. I need more of you in my day. I need to feel special. I need it for us to find some time that is just for me, when you're there just for me, because I love you and I feel really lonely a lot of times. See, now that's a lot easier to hear, right? And then you can say, let's do an overnight at the Salish Lodge next week. All right? Right? And I'll arrange the babysitting and everything. And he can say, wow, hot dog, she heard me. All right?
Yeah, no, that's great, because then when he would say that, I would do another one of the bad 4 horsemen. I'd get defensive and saying, but you got this meal on the table and you wouldn't have that if I, the luxury of having all this time to yourself in the evenings if I didn't take care of all these things. So I could own up to that too.
Right.
And do some of the things.
Yeah, and you can say, I miss you too, baby. I mean, let's do that. We may not be able to do it for another couple of weeks, but, I get it. Okay, that's the difference between criticism and a softened startup, where you're pointing your finger at yourself, saying what you need.
Thank you.
Okay, sure.
I just wanted to first say I'm a big fan, Dr. Gottman. Thank you for your work. I'm a therapist, and I work with primarily couples with severe marital problems. A lot of them are presenting with infidelity issues.
Yeah.
And so I'm just interested, and I think maybe others here might be interested too, in learning more about the repair model you might have for repairing trust and commitment to the marriage. Also what I noticed too, just one additional thought, is coming back to that comment about personality differences. I'm working with a couple right now where the wife is very introverted. And what I found in repairing the relationship, there needs to be a lot of openness and talk. And the husband's been really frustrated that he's not getting that from her.
Yeah.
So maybe if you could speak to that too, when there's that personality difference that might interfere with the transparency in the relationship. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so, let me just say the one thing we do is train clinicians, and that this is it's a longer, your questions are great, but they're a longer conversation than, for this talk. Let me just answer briefly and encourage you to, maybe if you have time to come to one of our workshops. In terms of these personality differences, it is really, I think it's a lost art. Conversation is becoming a lost art in our culture. And, it's something you can teach your clients, and they can learn how to do this. One of the essential elements of it is Eugene Gendlin, his work on focusing, which is really knowing what you feel by understanding your body and then being able to put words to images so you can talk about what you're feeling and understand that. So, that's part of conversation. And I think even if somebody's introverted, especially if they're introverted, they're usually better at looking inside and seeing what they feel. But the art of conversation may be something that you have to teach couples like that. And in terms of infidelity, we're about to do a randomized clinical trial on our therapy. But just briefly, we have a 3-phase therapy for healing from the betrayal of an affair. And the first phase we call atonement. And this really involves, understanding why this person is back and really understanding that the betrayed person has a post-traumatic stress disorder from the betrayal. And the need is really to talk and listen and atone for what was done. And that has to come before the second phase of understanding what it was in the marriage that was a problem. Otherwise, you blame the victim. The second stage after atonement is what we call attunement, because in affairs, there's almost invariably conflict avoidance and the avoidance of self-disclosure about negative things. So you have to really get people to attune to one another and build trust and be there for one another. And really bring their negativity to one another and say, you know, honey, I'm feeling really lonely right now because we have 2 young kids and you're multitasking and, you know, I don't get much of you and I miss you. And to really be able to say that and attune and, you know, and teach constructive ways of dealing with conflict and understand why the affair happened. What you really do a post-mortem on marriage number 1, relationship number 1, and change that, understand what's going on. And then the third phase we call attachment, which is really about commitment, building commitment, and you know has a lot of components to it. But that's basically a pattern, and we don't know if it works. I mean, we've done a lot of clinical work with it, but you know we really have to do a study and evaluate whether it's effective. Welcome.
Good evening, Dr. Gottman. Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. And, you know, starting to understand and being new to the venue of the Gottman theories and institute, you know, I know that I'm operating in a negative sentimental override, and there's times to where I have formed the habits of facial expression and flinching and these things that you've studied in your love lab. And when we start to communicate, me and my wife will at times immediately ask what I do wrong, what are these things? And I know that she didn't do that before because I know she didn't. And I know that it's a direct result of overexposure to me. And so when we get to that point, and because it's something that I haven't necessarily heard you talk about, and I haven't read in your books yet, it may be in there, how do I get away from the facial expressions of flinching and those things that are built into me as a wired mechanism, and another way to mend or repair the instant, what did I do wrong now, response from my wife when I do flinch or act in that negative sentimental pattern?
Well, you know, I wouldn't try to control your facial expressions. I mean, they are what they are. And they're a window into what you feel and what you need. So I think, you know, at that point, you know, if my wife was saying, you know, you look really hostile or angry or contemptuous, you know, I sort of listen to that and I go inside and try to think, yeah, you know, I am feeling that way. And then I really try to do the work that says, here's what I need from you. And here's what would be my recipe for success at the moment. You know, I need some reassurance, or I need your time, or I need you to listen to, you know, all the stresses that I've been going through this week. I feel very alone right now, or whatever it is that I'm feeling. Rather than controlling your emotions are your GPS in life, and they always have information in them. Behind every negative emotion, behind every one of them, there's a longing. And within that longing, there's a recipe for what will work for you. So don't try to control your emotions. Just use them as a way of understanding what you feel. I mean, most people, when they're angry, there's usually a goal they have that's getting frustrated. Mm-hmm. So there's great information in anger, right? What's my goal and what's frustrating it? When they're sad, there's something missing, something lost. But what's missing? What's lost? What do you need? You know, when they're afraid, there's a way. You know, when they feel unsafe or threatened, there's some ways to make their world safer for them. So what are those ways? So I wouldn't worry so much about your face and really think about what is it you're feeling. Put words to it in a way that is not an attack, but really a disclosure of what you're feeling, and try to find that positive need, that way that she can be successful with you.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you all for listening. I really enjoyed talking to you. Good night.